What if we're not the first civilization to reach this level? Not even close. What if we're the seventh? Think about it. We assume we're special, unique, the only intelligent civilization Earth has ever produced. We look at the pyramids and think, wow, look how far we've come since then. We find a 10,000-year-old settlement and call it ancient. We act like recorded history, those 5,000 or 6,000 years of written records, represents the full story of human achievement. But what if it doesn't? What if it's just the story of the survivors? There's this idea, whispered about in fringe archaeology and ancient texts, that human civilization is cyclical, that we rise, we advance, we build incredible things, and then something happens. Something catastrophic. Something that erases almost everything and forces the few survivors to start over from scratch. And it's happened before. Not once, not twice, 6 times. We are, according to this theory, the 7th attempt. The 7th civilization to climb out of the darkness and reach for the stars. And every single one before us was reset, wiped clean, returned to 0. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like fantasy, like mythology, and maybe it is. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. What if mythology is just history that survived in the only way it could? As stories, ancient texts from cultures that never contacted each other tell remarkably similar tales. The Hopis speak of multiple worlds before this one, each destroyed when humanity lost its way. Hindu scriptures describe vast cycles of creation and destruction spanning millions of years. Plato wrote about Atlantis, an advanced civilization swallowed by the sea. The Sumerians recorded stories of antediluvian kings who ruled for thousands of years before a great flood reset everything. These aren't just random stories. They're too consistent, too widespread, too specific about the idea that the world we live in now has been built on the ruins of something that came before. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So subscribe if you want and tell me, where are you right now and what time is it? I love checking the comments. Tokyo at sunrise, London at midnight, Sao Paulo in the afternoon. All of us wondering about the same mysteries at different moments around this spinning rock. Here's what really gets me. We know for a fact that Earth has been through multiple apocalyptic events, massive asteroid impacts, supervolcano eruptions, ice ages that buried continents under miles of ice, magnetic pole reversals, climate shifts that turned lush forests into deserts overnight. These aren't theories, they happened, and we know humans or our ancestors lived through some of them. We survived. Barely. Like that genetic bottleneck 900,000 years ago when we were down to just over 1,000 individuals. We've been to the edge of extinction before, so here's the haunting question. What if during the periods between these catastrophes, during the stable times, humans didn't just survive? What if they thrived? What if they built cities and developed technologies and created civilizations that would seem impossible to us now? And then, when the next reset came, when the comet hit or the poles flipped or the ice returned, it all got buried, erased, forgotten, leaving only myths, only stories told around fires by the survivors to their children, stories that got passed down for so many generations they stopped sounding like history and started sounding like fantasy. What we're going to do tonight is walk through 6 alleged civilizations that came before us. 6 different worlds, 6 different peaks of human achievement, and 6 different catastrophic events that ended them. Some of these stories come from ancient texts, some from geological evidence, some from anomalies that mainstream archaeology can't quite explain. We're going to explore what might have triggered each reset, what force was powerful enough to erase nearly all evidence that these civilizations even existed. And then we're going to ask the really uncomfortable question. If it happened 6 times before, what makes us think it won't happen again? Before there were pyramids, before there were cave paintings, before there were stone tools or fire circles or burial mounds, was there something else? Not just earlier versions of us struggling through ice ages and volcanic winters, but something fundamentally different. Something so far removed from our understanding of human civilization that we can barely recognize its traces. Something that existed not in thousands of years ago, but millions, maybe tens of millions. This is where the story gets strange, where documented history gives way to whispers, where archaeology meets mythology, where the line between evidence and imagination becomes almost impossible to draw. But stay with this. Because what if those whispers are trying to tell us something? What if the myths that appear in every culture on Earth, describing ages before our age, worlds before our world, aren't just stories? What if they're memories? Every ancient tradition speaks of a golden age. The Greeks called it the age of Chronos, when humans lived like gods, free from toil and suffering, when the earth gave forth its bounty without being forced, when death came gently like sleep after a long and peaceful life. The Hindus describe the Satya Yuga, the age of truth, when humans lived for thousands of years and possessed abilities we would call supernatural today. Indigenous traditions across the Americas speak of previous worlds, earlier creations that existed before this one, each destroyed and remade in endless cycles. These aren't isolated myths. They appear everywhere, in ancient Persia, in Aboriginal Australia, in the oral traditions of Africa, in the legends of Pacific Islanders. Different names, different details, but the same basic pattern. There was a time before this time. There were people before these people, and something terrible happened to them. Most scholars dismiss these stories as metaphorical, as primitive attempts to explain the world through fantasy. But what if that's exactly backward? What if these traditions are trying to preserve actual information about actual events, using the only tools available, story and symbol and metaphor, to pass knowledge across thousands of generations? Consider what we know about deep time, about the true age of the Earth. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have existed for maybe 300,000 years. But Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Complex life has existed for over 500 million years. Mammals have walked this planet for more than 200 million years. The dinosaurs ruled for 170 million years before that asteroid ended their reign 66 million years ago. Now, think about what we would leave behind. Imagine human civilization disappeared tomorrow. Not gradually, not with warning, but suddenly. Gone. Everything we've built, every city, every road, every monument, exposed to geological time. How long would it last? Modern buildings would crumble within centuries. Steel rusts, concrete crumbles. Even our most impressive structures, the pyramids, the Great Walls, the massive dams, would be worn to nothing by erosion within a few 100,000 years. Maybe 1 million if conditions were perfect. But 1 million years is nothing. It's a rounding error in geological time. It's 0.02% of the time since the dinosaurs died. It's 0.0002% of Earth's total age. So if there had been a civilization 10 million years ago, or 50 million, or 100 million, what evidence would remain? Almost none. Maybe some unusual mineral deposits, maybe some strange geological formations that don't quite fit the standard models, maybe some anomalies in the fossil record that paleontologists argue about but can never quite explain. Maybe nothing at all except stories. The myths call them the ethereal ones, the shining ones, the first people. Descriptions vary wildly, but certain themes repeat. They were tall, impossibly tall. They were beautiful beyond description. They lived in harmony with the earth. They possessed knowledge of the stars and the movements of celestial bodies. They could manipulate forces of nature that we don't understand. Some traditions suggest they weren't entirely physical, that they existed in a state we can barely conceive, somewhere between matter and energy, between form and formlessness. This sounds like pure fantasy, but consider this. We think of physical bodies as solid, substantial things, but modern physics tells us that's an illusion. You're mostly empty space. The atoms that make up your body are 99.9999% empty. The particles that make up those atoms aren't really particles at all, not in the way we think of solid objects. They're probability clouds, quantum fluctuations, things that exist in multiple states until observed. What if the first civilization understood this better than we do? What if they developed technologies or biological adaptations that let them manipulate their own physical state? Not magic, just very, very advanced understanding of physics that we're only beginning to grasp today. Pure speculation, obviously. We have no evidence for this, but we also wouldn't expect evidence. Not after tens of millions of years. Not after what happened to them. Because according to the myths, the Golden Age didn't end gradually. It ended in catastrophe. Sudden, violent, complete. The stories describe it with remarkable consistency across cultures. Fire from the heavens, the sky itself burning, the sun becoming dark, the stars falling from their places, the earth shaking so violently that mountains crumbled and oceans rose up and swallowed entire continents. For a long time, scholars assumed these were descriptions of natural disasters that early humans witnessed. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, meteor impacts, impressive and terrifying to primitive people, but nothing that could actually destroy a global civilization if one had existed. But what if the descriptions are more literal than we think? What if something happened on a scale that makes our worst nightmares look tame? The geological record shows Earth has been hit by cosmic catastrophes multiple times. The asteroid that killed the dinosaurs was just the most recent major impact. Before that, there was the Permian extinction, 252 million years ago, when 96% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates went extinct. Before that, the Ordovician extinction, the Devonian extinction, the Triassic extinction. 5 major mass extinctions in the last 500 million years, and probably dozens of smaller catastrophes that would still be absolutely devastating to any intelligent species living through them. But mass extinctions from asteroid impacts leave evidence. Iridium layers in the geological record, impact craters, global distributions of shocked quartz. We can date these events precisely. We can trace their effects through the fossil record, and none of them line up with the myths. The human stories of world-ending catastrophes describe events in the relatively recent past, measured in thousands or tens of thousands of years, not millions. Unless the first civilization existed in a geological epoch we don't properly understand yet. Unless there are catastrophes that don't leave the kind of evidence we know how to look for. Consider solar events. Our sun is a variable star. It goes through cycles of activity, periods of intense energy output followed by quieter phases. We've documented 11-year cycles, longer Gleisberg cycles, possibly even longer cycles we haven't had time to observe yet. During periods of high solar activity, the sun can produce massive coronal mass ejections, plasma storms that can slam into Earth's magnetic field with devastating force. In 1859, we experienced what's called the Carrington event, a massive solar flare that caused telegraph systems worldwide to fail, started fires, shocked operators. If it happened today, with our dependence on electronics, it would cause trillions in damage and potentially knock out power grids for months or years. But the Carrington event was mild compared to what the sun is capable of. Studies of other sun-like stars show they occasionally produce superflares, events thousands of times more powerful than anything we've observed from our own sun. If Earth was hit by a superflare, the effects would be apocalyptic. The atmosphere itself could be partially stripped away, The protective ozone layer could be destroyed. Radiation levels at the surface could become lethal. The climate could shift violently and unpredictably, and it would leave almost no geological trace, no impact crater, no iridium layer, just a thin period in the fossil record where certain species suddenly vanished and others appeared to have suffered severe radiation damage. What if that's what happened to the first civilization? What if they existed during a period of solar stability, built their culture, developed their technologies, spread across the planet, and then the sun, without warning, erupted in fury they couldn't defend against? The myths describe the survivors. A few who found shelter deep underground or in protected valleys, or somehow adapted to the changed conditions. But they were changed too, reduced, made smaller and weaker and less capable than their ancestors, forced to start over with fragments of the old knowledge, trying to preserve what they could in stories and symbols and traditions that would outlast the physical evidence. Or maybe there were no survivors. Maybe the first civilization was completely annihilated. Every individual, every structure, every trace of their existence burned away, or buried under miles of sediment or transformed by geological processes we can't track. Maybe all that survived was something stranger, something woven into the fabric of the Earth itself, echoes in the planetary consciousness, if such a thing exists. Memories encoded in ways we don't understand, accessible only through intuition and dreams and the myths we tell ourselves about where we came from. This sounds mystical, unscientific. But consider quantum entanglement. Consider the observer effect. Consider that consciousness itself remains the greatest unsolved mystery in science. We don't know what it is, where it comes from, or how it arises from mere matter. We don't know if it's confined to individual brains, or if there are ways it can be shared, stored, transmitted across time and space through mechanisms we haven't discovered yet. The first civilization would have had millions of years to explore these questions, if they existed, if they were as advanced as the myths suggest, if they disappeared in a cosmic catastrophe that left barely a trace. We're left with shadows, with stories, with the nagging sense that human history is far stranger and far older than the textbooks admit, with the unsettling possibility that we're not building civilization for the first time, that we're rebuilding it, that we're the inheritors of something vast and lost, trying to find our way back to knowledge that was once understood perfectly and then forgotten almost completely. And if we're rebuilding, if this has happened before, then the question becomes unavoidable. What triggered the reset that destroyed them? And could it happen again? The survivors of the first civilization scattered like seeds on cosmic winds. Some say they drifted eastward, across waters that no longer exist, toward a landmass that modern maps refuse to acknowledge. They called it many names: Lemuria, Mu, the motherland of the Pacific, a continent that supposedly stretched across the world's largest ocean, connecting what we now call Easter Island to Madagascar, encompassing territories that today lie thousands of feet beneath the waves. The story of Lemuria begins not with ancient mystics, but with 19th century zoologists trying to solve a puzzle. Why did lemurs appear in both Madagascar and India, separated by thousands of miles of ocean, but nowhere in between? English zoologist Philip Sclater proposed a radical solution in 1864. There must have been a land bridge, a now sunken continent he called Lemuria, that once connected these distant shores. The theory was eventually abandoned when plate tectonics offered better explanations. Continental drift, not sunken land masses. But the name stuck, and the legends that attached themselves to it grew far stranger than anything Sclater had imagined. Because across the Pacific, indigenous peoples had been telling stories about lost homelands for thousands of years before any European scientist coined the term Lemuria. The Polynesians spoke of Hiva, a great land in the east from which their ancestors came. The Maori remembered Hawaii, the ancestral homeland swallowed by the sea. Tamil texts from southern India described Kumari Kandam, a vast continent south of modern India where the first Tamil civilization flourished before the ocean claimed it. Different names, different peoples, but the same haunting theme. Our ancestors came from a land that no longer exists, a place the sea took back. The theoretical Lemurians, according to those who piece together fragments of mythology and unexplained archaeology, weren't quite like us. They were described in various traditions as beings more attuned to the natural world, less focused on the technological and more aligned with what we might call spiritual or psychic development. Some accounts suggest they were giants, others that they were slender and ethereal. What most traditions agree on is that they lived in profound harmony with their environment, understanding forces of nature that we've long forgotten how to perceive, let alone control. Their civilization supposedly flourished during a period geologists call the Pliocene or early Pleistocene, somewhere between 5 million and 2 million years ago, though the timelines shift depending on which tradition you follow. During this era, the Pacific Ocean looked different than it does today. Sea levels fluctuated wildly with the advance and retreat of ice ages. Land bridges appeared and disappeared. Islands rose from volcanic activity and sank again when the magma chambers beneath them collapsed. And here's where legend brushes against scientific possibility. The Pacific Ring of Fire, that horseshoe of tectonic activity surrounding the Pacific Ocean, is the most geologically volatile region on Earth. 90% of the world's earthquakes happen here. 3/4 of the world's active volcanoes line its edges. The Pacific Plate is constantly grinding against surrounding plates, subducting beneath some, overriding others, creating the conditions for catastrophic events that could absolutely destroy entire civilizations. Modern geology confirms that land can vanish. We've watched it happen. When Krakatoa erupted in 1883, it destroyed 2/3 of the island it sat on, sending it to the ocean floor. The explosion was heard 3,000 miles away. Ash circled the globe, cooling temperatures worldwide for years, and that was a relatively minor event compared to what the geological record shows is possible. Super eruptions, events so massive they make modern volcanoes look like candles compared to forest fires, these have happened repeatedly throughout Earth's history. The Toba super eruption 74,000 years ago ejected 670 cubic miles of rock and ash. It created a volcanic winter that nearly ended humanity. We've already talked about that bottleneck, but imagine something similar happening not to scattered tribes of early humans, but to an established civilization. Cities, agriculture, accumulated knowledge, all of it buried under ash or swallowed when the land itself collapsed into the emptied magma chambers below. This is the theorized trigger for Lemuria's fall. Not a single event, but a cascade of geological catastrophes. Maybe it started with increased volcanic activity, eruptions that the Lemurians initially survived, adapting, relocating, persisting. But then the tectonic forces that had been building for millennia reached a critical point. The Pacific Plate shifted dramatically. Subduction zones that had been stable for thousands of years suddenly weren't. Massive earthquakes, measuring magnitudes we've never recorded in human history, shattered the landscape, and then the land itself began to sink. Not overnight, but fast enough that within a few generations, territories that had supported millions were beneath the waves. The survivors fled in all directions, carrying fragments of their knowledge to distant shores. Some supposedly reached the Americas, teaching pyramid construction to peoples who would later become the Mayans and Aztecs. Others made it to Asia, seeding civilizations in the Indus Valley in southern India. Still others sailed to the scattered islands that remained, becoming the ancestors of the Pacific Islanders, whose navigation skills and ocean knowledge seem impossibly advanced for cultures that supposedly developed in isolation. The physical evidence is frustratingly ambiguous but tantalizing. Off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan, there's a massive underwater stone structure that looks disturbingly artificial. Straight edges, right angles, steps and terraces that seem carved rather than naturally formed. Geologists remain divided. Some insist it's entirely natural, a product of normal erosion and tectonic activity. Others point to specific features that don't match any known natural geological process. Tool marks, supposedly, intentional shaping, evidence of construction techniques. The formation sits 75 feet underwater, which means if it is artificial, it was built during the last ice age when sea levels were much lower. That puts its construction at least 10,000 years ago, potentially much older. Mainstream archaeology insists humans of that era didn't build monumental stone structures. We were still hunter-gatherers, still living in small bands, still tens of thousands of years away from developing the social organization and technical knowledge required for architectural projects on that scale. But there it sits, defying easy explanation. Similar structures appear elsewhere in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Underwater formations off the coast of India near Mahabalipuram, submerged stone platforms near Okinawa, unexplained ruins scattered across Micronesia and Polynesia. Each individual site can be explained away. Natural formation, post-Ice Age settlement that got flooded, recent construction that sank due to earthquakes. But taken together, they form a pattern that whispers of something larger, something lost. The Tamil texts are perhaps the most specific. Ancient literature describes Kumarikandam as lying south of present-day India, stretching toward Antarctica. They describe not a primitive society, but an advanced civilization with cities, ports, centers of learning. They describe it being consumed by the ocean in stages, 3 separate inundations over thousands of years. The last survivors fled north to what is now southern India, carrying their language, their literature, their memories of a homeland that no longer appears on any map. Could all of this be myth building on myth, cultural memory of minor coastal flooding blown up into legends of sunken continents? Absolutely. But could it also be distorted memory of something real, something that happened when the Earth was geologically restless and sea levels were in flux? The question hangs in the air like salt spray over empty ocean, unanswered and unanswerable, at least with what we know today. If the first 2 civilizations disappeared into cosmic fire and geological subsidence, the third met its end in the most visceral, terrifying way imaginable. Water. Not a gentle rising tide, but walls of destruction that swept across continents, redrawing coastlines, drowning cities, erasing everything in their path. This was Atlantis, and whether it was exactly as Plato described or something even stranger, the evidence suggests something catastrophic happened when the last ice age ended, something that almost reset humanity to zero. Let's start with what we think we know. Around 360 BCE, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote 2 dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, describing a powerful island civilization that existed 9,000 years before his time. He called it Atlantis. According to Plato, this wasn't just another ancient city. It was a technological and architectural marvel. Massive circular walls, advanced irrigation systems, sophisticated metallurgy, a navy that dominated the Mediterranean. They had engineering capabilities that shouldn't have existed in the Stone Age. They had social organization that rivaled classical Greece itself. And then, in a single day and night of catastrophic destruction, the entire civilization sank beneath the waves. For centuries, scholars dismissed this as philosophical allegory, Plato making up a cautionary tale about hubris and divine punishment. But here's what's interesting. Plato wasn't writing fiction. He was specific about his sources, claiming the story came from Egyptian priests who kept records going back thousands of years. He gave specific dates, specific geographical details. He wrote about Atlantis with the same matter-of-fact tone he used when discussing real historical events, and he insisted, repeatedly, that this was a true account. Now, maybe Plato was wrong, maybe his sources were wrong. But here's where the story gets genuinely strange. Because Plato's account of a great flood destroying an advanced civilization, it's not unique, not even close. Travel to ancient Sumer and you find the Epic of Gilgamesh, describing a massive deluge that wiped out humanity, except for one family who built a boat. Move to Hebrew tradition, and you get the story of Noah, same basic narrative, worldwide flood, divine judgment, handful of survivors. Journey to India, and the ancient texts describe Manu, warned by a fish god about coming floods, building a vessel to preserve humanity. Cross the ocean to Mesoamerica and the Aztecs, Maya and Inca all have flood legends describing the destruction of previous worlds by water. These aren't just similar stories, they're eerily consistent. Massive floods, divine or cosmic warning, a few prepared survivors, the destruction of a previous civilization, and most tellingly, they all place these events at roughly the same period, somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago, right at the end of the last ice age. That's not coincidence, that's geological timing. Because here's what actually happened around 11,600 years ago. The planet was emerging from the last glacial maximum. For 100,000 years, ice sheets had covered vast portions of North America, Europe, and Asia. Some of these ice sheets were 2 miles thick. They held unimaginable quantities of water that had been locked away from the oceans for millennia. And then the climate shifted, temperatures rose, not gradually but in sudden dramatic pulses. The ice began to melt, fast. When ice sheets collapse, they don't melt uniformly. They fail catastrophically. Massive ice dams holding back glacial lakes suddenly give way, releasing floods that make modern tsunamis look like bathtub ripples. The geological evidence for these events is undeniable. The channeled scablands in Washington state, carved by floods that moved more water than all the rivers on Earth combined. The Black Sea deluge when rising Mediterranean waters burst through a natural dam and flooded thousands of square miles of inhabited coastal plains in a matter of months, maybe weeks. The flooding of Sunderland, a vast continental shelf connecting Southeast Asia that went underwater as sea levels rose nearly 400 feet. Think about what 400 feet of sea level rise means. Every coastal city gone. Every river valley settlement drowned. Every low-lying plain that humans had inhabited for thousands of years suddenly beneath the waves. If there was an advanced civilization during the Ice Age, if they were smart enough to settle near coastlines where resources were abundant and travel was easy, then we would expect exactly what we see. Their cities underwater, their achievements erased, their survivors scattered and traumatized, carrying only memories of what had been lost. And maybe that wasn't even the worst of it. Some researchers point to evidence of a possible asteroid or comet impact around this same period. Platinum anomalies in sediment layers, widespread burn marks in the geological record, sudden temperature spikes followed by dramatic cooling. If a cosmic impact hit the ice sheets themselves, the resulting melt would have been apocalyptic. Instant vaporization of billions of tons of ice. Floods that would make the Black Sea deluge look gentle. Coastal areas hit by walls of water moving faster than any human could run. The survivors of such a catastrophe wouldn't just lose their cities, they'd lose their entire way of life, their trade networks, their accumulated knowledge, their technological infrastructure. Within a generation or two, the descendants of engineers and astronomers could be reduced to hunter-gatherers, keeping only dim oral traditions about the world that drowned. But did this civilization actually exist? The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. Off the coast of Bimini in the Bahamas, divers have photographed massive stone structures underwater. Long straight walls, right-angle corners, rectangular platforms. Skeptics say they're natural beach rock formations. Believers point out that nature rarely makes such regular geometric shapes. In Mauritania, the Richet structure forms a near-perfect series of concentric circles visible from space, matching Plato's description of Atlantis' design almost exactly. Geologists insist it's an eroded geological dome. Alternative researchers ask why it looks so much like what Plato described. The truth is, we're looking for evidence of a civilization that existed before the invention of writing, before pottery, before agriculture. If it was there, it would have been swept away by the very catastrophe that makes its existence plausible. We're searching for ghosts underwater and wondering why they're so hard to find. But maybe the most compelling evidence isn't physical, it's narrative. Why do cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years all remember the same catastrophe? Why do they all describe it as punishment for hubris, for civilizations that reached too far, that thought themselves equal to the gods? Maybe because that's what happens when climate catastrophes destroy everything. The survivors need an explanation. They need their suffering to mean something. So they tell themselves that the old world fell because it deserved to fall, that the reset came because it had to come, and then they begin again, building on drowned foundations they can no longer see. Now we come to something darker, something that appears in so many ancient texts that dismissing it as pure mythology becomes harder with each new correlation you discover. We're talking about the age before the flood, the Antediluvian world, a civilization that didn't just fall to natural disaster, but tore itself apart with weapons so devastating that the gods themselves supposedly intervened to stop the carnage. Every culture has them. The giants, the Nephilim in Hebrew texts, described as the offspring of fallen angels and human women, beings of such power and corruption that their presence alone contaminated the earth. The Titans of Greek mythology, primordial beings who waged war against the gods themselves, wielding the very forces of nature as weapons. The Jotun of Norse legend, giants whose conflicts with the Aesir would eventually bring about Ragnarok, the end of everything. The Quinametsin of Aztec tradition, giants who built massive structures before being wiped out by catastrophic floods. These aren't isolated stories, they're global. The Paiute people of North America spoke of red-haired giants who were eventually destroyed. Hindu texts described Daityas and Danavas, massive beings who possessed knowledge forbidden to ordinary humans. Pacific Islander myths are filled with stories of giant ancestors who built the megalithic structures that still dot their islands. Even Chinese mythology speaks of giant kings who ruled before the Great Flood reshaped the world. You start to notice patterns. These beings aren't just big, they're technologically advanced. They possess knowledge that seems impossible for their era. They engage in warfare that sounds less like ancient combat and more like something from a science fiction nightmare. Most tellingly, they're consistently described as corrupt, as having overstepped boundaries that should never have been crossed. The Hebrew Book of Enoch, which didn't make it into most versions of the Bible but was widely read in ancient times, goes into disturbing detail about the antediluvian world. It describes the Watchers, angels who descended to earth and taught humans forbidden knowledge. Metallurgy, cosmetics, sorcery, astronomy beyond what should have been possible. Their offspring with human women were the Nephilim, giants who consumed everything, who eventually began consuming humans when regular food ran out. The text describes a world spiraling into such corruption and violence that divine intervention became necessary. Total reset, the flood. But here's where it gets interesting. What if these weren't just moral lessons? What if embedded in these myths are memories of something that actually happened? Not necessarily fallen angels and literal giants, but perhaps a civilization that had achieved technological heights we can barely imagine, that had created something hybrid technologies, genetic experimentation, weapons of mass destruction that ultimately led to their own annihilation. Consider the evidence that doesn't quite fit into conventional archaeology's timeline. Mohenjo-Daro, an ancient city in modern-day Pakistan. When archaeologists excavated it, they found something deeply unsettling. Large sections of the city showed signs of intense heat so extreme that it had vitrified the stone and pottery, turning them into glass. The conventional explanation is a massive fire, but fires don't typically generate the temperatures needed to vitrify stone. You need something hotter, much hotter. Some researchers have pointed out that the distribution of vitrified materials at Mohenjo-Daro resembles blast patterns radiating from specific points. Skeletons were found in the streets, unburied, as if whatever killed them happened so quickly there was no time for ritual burial. Some of these skeletons showed radiation levels significantly higher than background radiation, even accounting for natural decay over millennia. Then there's the ancient Sanskrit epic, the Mahabharata. Most people treat it as pure mythology, an elaborate fantasy about gods and heroes. But read the descriptions of weapons used in the Great War it describes. The Brahmastra, a weapon that could destroy entire armies, that produced a pillar of smoke and flame that rose into the sky, that made the hair and nails of survivors fall out, that contaminated food and water. The text describes warriors having to wash themselves and their equipment in rivers to avoid the effects of these weapons. Sound familiar? Because it sounds remarkably like descriptions of nuclear weapons and radiation poisoning. The Mahabharata describes weapons that could level cities, that created firestorms so intense they boiled the oceans, that left the earth barren for years afterward. One passage describes a weapon that produced a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe, an incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as 10,000 suns. You find similar descriptions in other ancient texts. The Ramayana, another Sanskrit epic, describes flying vehicles called vimanas that could travel across vast distances and rain destruction from above. The ancient Sumerian texts speak of weapons of the gods that could make the blood boil and turn cities to dust. Even the Bible contains passages that, when read without theological assumptions, sound disturbingly like descriptions of nuclear or thermonuclear explosions. In multiple deserts across the world, you find fields of fused glass. Trinitite in New Mexico, created by the first nuclear test in 1945, but also similar glass in the Egyptian desert, the Libyan desert, parts of the Gobi Desert, even sections of Scotland. The conventional explanation is meteor impacts or lightning strikes, but the distribution patterns don't always match what you'd expect from natural phenomena. Some of these glass fields cover areas too large and too evenly distributed to be explained by single impacts. Then there are the radioactive sites. Natural uranium deposits exist, sure, but there are locations where the isotope ratios are wrong, where the distribution of radioactive materials suggests artificial concentration or processing. The Oklo reactors in Gabon show evidence of natural nuclear fission occurring billions of years ago, proving it's possible under the right conditions. But could similar processes have been harnessed intentionally by a civilization we don't recognize as having existed? The theory goes like this. Sometime before the last major flood event, perhaps 12,000 years ago, perhaps much earlier, a global civilization reached a level of technological sophistication comparable to or exceeding our own. They developed weapons of mass destruction, maybe nuclear, maybe something we haven't rediscovered yet. They went to war. Not a small conflict, but total warfare that engulfed the world. The myths describe it as a war between gods and giants, between demons and divine beings. But strip away the religious language and you're left with descriptions of a civilization destroying itself with its own weapons. Cities vaporized in instants, atmospheric contamination, climate disruption from the sheer scale of destruction. Perhaps even tectonic destabilization if the weapons were powerful enough. And then the reset, whether you interpret it as divine intervention, as the myths claim, or simply as the natural consequence of pushing planetary systems past their breaking point, the result was the same. Catastrophic flooding, environmental collapse, the near-total erasure of whatever civilization had existed before. The survivors scattered to high ground, carrying fragmented memories of what had been lost. Over generations, the specific details faded, transformed into myths of giants and gods, of forbidden knowledge and divine punishment. But the core memory persisted. We had risen before, we'd fallen before. And the cause wasn't some external catastrophe we couldn't control. It was war. It was us. By the time the fifth civilization rose, the world had already forgotten Atlantis. The scars of the giant wars had faded into mountain ranges and buried craters. Oceans had calmed. Forests had crept back over shattered landscapes. To anyone living then, Earth would have seemed stable again, predictable, generous. They took that stability and did something astonishing with it. Where earlier cultures carved symbols, these people carved the planet. They moved mountains in a way, not by erasing them, but by echoing them in stone. Triangles of rock that mimicked distant peaks. Circles that mirrored constellations. Platforms that seemed to rise out of the ground as if the earth itself had decided to grow geometry. We call them megaliths, pyramids, temples, standing stones, but those are just our names, thousands of years too late. Look at the Great Pyramid of Giza. It's so familiar that it almost feels boring until you actually sit with it. 2.5 million stone blocks, each weighing as much as a truck, placed with such precision that a razor blade can barely slip between them. Aligned to true north with an accuracy that would challenge a modern surveyor working without GPS. Mainstream archaeology sees it as a monumental tomb built with time, labour and ingenuity, and that might be true, but there's another possibility. That what we're seeing is the surviving work of a culture that had been perfecting construction techniques for a very, very long time. A civilization of builders whose greatest achievements are not the pyramids we see, but the ones that didn't survive. Then there's Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, 12,000 years old, maybe older, already ancient when agriculture was supposed to be just beginning. Massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing more than 50 tons, arranged in perfect circles, decorated with carved animals, abstract symbols, hints of stories we can't quite read. According to the standard model, people at that time were still supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers. No cities, no writing, no complex religion. And yet here is an astronomical calendar, a ritual complex, an architectural project so advanced it would stretch even a settled farming society. Somebody organized the labor, somebody planned the layout. Somebody understood geometry, astronomy and stone, and then they buried it, carefully, as if they knew something was coming. Across the world at Pumapunku in the high Andes, another puzzle waits. Stones cut from andesite, one of the hardest rocks on Earth. Right angles so sharp they look machined. Complex interlocking blocks, drilled holes, repeating patterns that suggest templates and measuring systems. All at an altitude where breathing is difficult, and hauling stone seems almost impossible. Conventional explanations invoke patient craftsmanship and simple tools, and that may be all it was. But place Pumapunku next to Göbekli Tepe, next to the pyramids, next to dozens of other sites with oversized stones and unusual alignments, and a pattern starts to shimmer at the edge of your perception. Not proof, just something. Suggestive, a recurring style, a recurring obsession, massive, durable structures, astronomical alignments, sacred geometry, an almost desperate focus on orientation, to the sky, to the poles, to some invisible grid we can't quite see. If all these cultures were separate and independent, it's a remarkable coincidence. If they're echoes of a single forgotten tradition, it's something else entirely. Imagine a civilization whose primary technology wasn't silicon or steel, but stone and sky. A culture that understood the Earth's magnetic field as intimately as we understand electricity. That could track not just the daily movement of the sun, but slow, creeping shifts in the heavens. A people who read the planet the way we read charts and numbers. What if they weren't just building monuments? What if they were building instruments? Here's where the fifth civilization meets the trigger. Earth's magnetic field isn't stable. Geophysicists know that the magnetic poles wander, weaken, and every so often flip. North becomes south, south becomes north. It doesn't happen overnight, but it can happen faster than we'd like to think, on human timescales, not just geological ones. These events are called geomagnetic reversals, and they're written in the rocks. As lava cools, magnetic minerals lock in the direction of Earth's field like tiny compasses frozen in place. Layer after layer of ocean crust shows bands of reversed polarity spreading out from mid-ocean ridges. Proof that reversals are not theory, they are fact. What we don't fully understand is what it feels like to live through one. During a reversal, the field doesn't just flip, it weakens, it fragments. Multiple north and south poles may appear at the same time. The protective bubble that shields Earth from solar and cosmic radiation becomes patchy and thin. More high-energy particles reach the atmosphere. Auroras could dance at the equator. Radiation doses at the surface might spike. Climate patterns might shift as the upper atmosphere changes. Most species would probably muddle through. Life has done it before. But what about a civilization built on delicate systems we don't remember anymore? A society tuned to stable climates, predictable skies, and a strong magnetic shield. Some researchers point out that we're in a period of declining magnetic field strength right now, and that the North Magnetic Pole is racing across the Arctic faster than we've ever measured. That doesn't mean a reversal is imminent, it just means reversals are real, and sometimes the field behaves strangely. Now step back into the fifth civilization. If you were a culture obsessed with orientation, with cardinal directions, with tracking the slow tilt and wobble of Earth's axis, you might notice subtle changes long before we would. The sunrise not quite where it should be at a solstice. The stars drifting out of their expected paths. The behavior of compasses, if you had them, starting to shift. Some people think ancient builders encoded this awareness in their monuments. They point to the global alignment of sites, pyramids in Egypt, Mesoamerica, and China, all oriented with uncanny precision to the cardinal directions. Megalithic circles lining up with solstices and equinoxes, lines that seem to trace great circles around the globe, hinting at a forgotten system of geodesy. Skeptics argue that with enough sites, you can find patterns anywhere. They're not wrong, but the unease remains. How did pre-industrial societies achieve such precise alignments over and over again, across continents, supposedly without detailed knowledge of the globe? Then there are the maps. The Peri-Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, is famous for showing the coastline of South America with striking accuracy. But what fascinates alternative historians is what appears at the bottom, a landmass that looks like Antarctica, not the Antarctica we know, buried under kilometres of ice, but an older coastline, ice-free or at least partially so. Mainstream scholars see this as misinterpretation, a distorted southern extension of South America. Others suggest Piri Reis was compiling older source maps, copies of charts that went back far beyond any recorded maritime culture, charts from a time when polar regions were at least partially accessible, charts from a world with a different climate. The idea is speculative. It always comes back to that. But when you combine ancient maps, global alignments, and megalithic engineering that seems out of sequence with our timeline, a picture begins to form. A civilization of builders, navigators, skywatchers. One that might have known that the magnetic field was beginning to falter. Now imagine what happens when the field really starts to slip. Navigation goes haywire. Migration patterns of animals change, disrupting hunting and agriculture. Increased radiation slowly erodes health, weakens crops, mutates pathogens. Climate systems wobble, bringing drought to regions that depended on predictable rains, and storms to places that rarely saw them. Auroras in the tropics terrify people who had only ever seen calm skies. If the fifth civilization had any form of long-distance communication, electromagnetic or otherwise, a chaotic field could scramble it. If they used the sky and the magnetic field to synchronize rituals, plantings, travel, their entire cultural calendar would unravel. Temples aligned to solstices would misfire, the sun no longer rising in the doorway it was meant to bless. Priests, astronomers, wise ones, whatever they called them, would lose their grip on prediction, and prediction is power. When nature stops following the rules your civilization is built on, faith cracks, institutions lose authority, panic spreads. Wars might break out over the last stable regions. Coastal cities, already vulnerable, could be hammered by a changing climate, rising seas, shifting storm tracks. Inland centres might face lethal droughts or sudden cold snaps as circulation patterns lurch into new configurations. Over generations, not days, the fifth civilization would come apart. Not in a single explosion, but in a slow, grinding unravelling. Trade networks failing. Large construction projects abandoned. Knowledge concentrated in a few enclaves and then lost as those enclaves fell. But stone remembers. Massive blocks don't care if the magnetic poles flip. They don't care if languages die or stories fade. They just sit there, eroding grain by grain, waiting for someone else to wonder why they exist. What we see now may be the after-image of that lost world. Pyramids that are copies of older designs, temples built on foundations whose original builders were already gone, oral traditions whispered down through millennia that speak of times when the sky burned and the directions were wrong. We can't prove the fifth civilization existed as a single global culture. We can't prove a magnetic reversal triggered its fall, but the rocks and the records leave just enough room for the possibility. Just enough room for the thought that human ingenuity may have risen high, more than once, only to be knocked back by forces far beyond any king or engineer. And as we trace alignments, decode symbols, and map the invisible bubble of our own magnetic shield, a quiet question lingers in the background. If the builders really watched the field fail and the sky change, would we notice, in time, if it started to happen again? By the time the last ice age was winding down, the world must have felt like it was finally exhaling. For hundreds of thousands of years, ice sheets had locked up oceans, lowered sea levels, reshaped entire continents. But around 13,000 years ago, something started to change. Temperatures rose, glaciers retreated, rivers swelled with meltwater, forests crept north into lands that had been frozen for ages. Big game animals followed the greening landscape, and wherever those animals went, humans followed too. This was the world just before the Younger Dryas, a brief warm pulse at the end of the Pleistocene, when conditions in many regions became unusually mild, stable, and predictable. For hunter-gatherers, it would have felt like a golden age. More plants, more animals, more fresh water, longer growing seasons, less brutally cold winters. Under conditions like that, humans don't just survive, they experiment. Archaeologists see hints of this in the record. More permanent settlements along fertile river valleys, more complex tools, the first clear signs that some groups were starting to manipulate plants, not just gather them. In the Near East, the Natufian culture built substantial stone houses, stored grain, and buried their dead in carefully arranged graves. In other regions, people began constructing enigmatic stone structures that seemed to serve no obvious practical purpose. To mainstream archaeology, this is the threshold of agriculture, the dawn of villages, the very first steps towards civilization. But some researchers think the story might be bigger. Writers like Graham Hancock have suggested that by 12,800 years ago, humans might already have reached a level of organization and knowledge far beyond simple foraging camps. Maybe not skyscrapers and smartphones, but something in between. A civilization advanced enough to map the skies, track precession of the equinoxes, engineer megalithic sites, and preserve knowledge in stone. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey fuel this suspicion. Massive T-shaped pillars weighing tons, arranged in circles, carved with intricate animal reliefs, erected by people who, according to conventional timelines, shouldn't have had either the time or the surplus resources to build anything so monumental. The site is dated to roughly 11,600 years ago, but that's after the disaster. Some wonder whether it was built not as the beginning of something, but as a memorial to something that had already been lost. If that's true, then the sixth civilization might have been a world of coastal settlements now drowned beneath modern seas. Fishing cultures and riverine cities strung along the edges of continents, tracking the stars, observing long cycles in Earth's climate, maybe even warning of dangers that would erupt from the sky. A global network not of satellites and fiber optics, but of sailors and storytellers, passing knowledge along ocean routes that have been underwater for 12,000 years. Whatever was happening, whatever level of complexity they achieved, they were living on the edge of a loaded gun. Because around 12,800 years ago, the climate didn't just wobble, it snapped. This sudden reversal is called the Younger Dryas. In ice cores drilled from Greenland, you can see it like a vertical cliff in the data. Temperatures plummeted in a matter of years, maybe even months. The northern hemisphere, which had been warming, was yanked back into near glacial conditions. Precipitation patterns shifted. Ecosystems that had just begun to flourish collapsed. For decades, scientists argued over what could cause such a violent climate whiplash. One idea proposed in the late 2000s is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. According to this controversial but intriguing theory, a fragmented comet or swarm of cometary debris slammed into Earth's atmosphere and surface somewhere in the northern hemisphere around 12,800 years ago. Not one neat crater, but many airbursts and impacts scattered across an ice-covered world. The evidence proponents point to is scattered but unsettlingly consistent. Across a layer of sediment dating to the very start of the Younger Dryas, researchers have found microscopic diamonds, nanodiamonds, formed under conditions of extreme heat and pressure. They found tiny glass spherules that look like droplets of rock melted in an instant and flung into the air. They've measured spikes in platinum concentrations, an element rare in Earth's crust but more common in certain types of meteorites and cometary material. This peculiar layer shows up on multiple continents: North America, Europe, the Middle East. Different soils, different environments, the same strange chemical fingerprint, as if something global had happened in a geological heartbeat. Then there are the Carolina Bays, thousands of shallow elliptical depressions scattered across the Atlantic coastal plain of the United States, oriented in eerily similar directions. For years their origin has been debated: wind and water, glacial processes, or something else. Some researchers have suggested they might be secondary impact features, scars left by debris raining down into melt-softened ground after a larger explosion in the ice sheet to the north. It's not a settled question, but the coincidence of timing keeps the argument alive. Whether or not the impact hypothesis is ultimately accepted by mainstream science, the fact remains: something catastrophic happened. Right at the onset of the Younger Dryas, the world's climate lurched. And whatever this did to the skies, it also did something brutal to life on the ground. In North America, megafauna that had thrived for hundreds of thousands of years vanished in a geological blink. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, American lions, short-faced bears, gone. Similar patterns appear in parts of South America and Eurasia. Climate change alone might explain some of it. Overhunting by expanding human populations might explain some more. But the timing is suspiciously tight. Many of these extinctions line up right with that mysterious boundary layer, the same layer that shows those anomalous particles and platinum spikes. And if animals suffered, humans did too. Archaeological cultures that had been flourishing before 12,800 years ago suddenly contract, fragment, or disappear from the record. In North America, the Clovis culture, famous for its fluted spear points, declines and fades just as the Younger Dryas begins. In the Near East, early experiments with settled lifestyle. Plant domestication pauses. People revert to more mobile, opportunistic ways of living. If there really was a sixth civilization before the Younger Dryas, a network of relatively sophisticated coastal societies, its worst vulnerability would have been exactly where it lived, on the shore. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels were still far lower than today. Vast coastal plains existed where now there is only ocean. Shelf edges were dry land. Estuaries and deltas stretched far out from present coastlines. A cometary impact into the northern ice sheets could have triggered enormous meltwater floods. Glacial lakes would have overtopped their natural dams. Walls of water would have roared down river valleys, scouring everything in their path. Over the next 1,200 years, the Younger Dryas kept the climate locked in a cold, unstable state. Ice melted, refroze, advanced, retreated. Sea levels didn't rise in a neat straight line. They lurched. Each surge of meltwater carved new channels, drowned old shorelines, reshaped bays and inlets. Any settlements built along those ancient coasts would first be battered by floods, then slowly swallowed by the rising seas. Stone could survive. Wood, cloth, paper, early metals, not so much. A maritime civilization without mass-produced iron, concrete, or plastics might leave only scattered traces. A few enigmatic ruins on hilltops that used to be islands. A handful of anomalous artifacts in caves, myths of fire from the sky, and floods that chase people to the mountains. In many traditions around the world, you find strangely specific stories of a time when the world suddenly grew cold again, when the seasons became unreliable, when monstrous animals died off, when the sea rose and swallowed the works of earlier peoples. In most cultures, these are treated as symbolic tales. In the context of the Younger Dryas, they start to look like distorted memories. What we know for certain is this. Around 12,800 years ago, the climate system was violently disrupted. For about 1,200 years, the planet endured a relapse into glacial chill before finally warming again. During that long, unstable interval, ecosystems were rearranged, coastlines redrawn, and human populations forced to adapt or vanish. If a sixth civilization existed then, more advanced than we imagine, less advanced than we are, it would have been hit from 3 directions at once. Fire from above, ice and cold from the north, and water rising from the coasts, a triple blow. Enough to erase most of its physical footprint, leaving behind only scattered stones, chemical traces in the soil, and stories whispered forward through generations. When the Younger Dryas finally ended around 11,600 years ago, the world that emerged was not the same world that had gone in. The ice retreated for good, sea levels stabilized higher than before, new shorelines became the stage for our own documented history. And somewhere in that transition, in the gap between what we can prove and what we can only suspect, lies the shadow of the sixth civilization, erased by a comet, buried under oceans, remembered only in myths and mysteries we're still trying to decode. By the time you've walked through 6 endings, something strange starts to happen. Your brain begins to draw lines between events that are supposedly separated by millions of years, by oceans, by completely different levels of technology. The stories shouldn't match, and yet they do. The first pattern is the oldest, and maybe the most unsettling. Something keeps hitting us from above. In the story of the ethereal ones, it's a cosmic disturbance, a disturbance in the very fabric of space. In the tale of Atlantis, it's the wrath of water following celestial omens. In the pre-Younger Dryas world, it's a comet strike, fragments burning through the atmosphere, turning sky into weapon. Different eras, different details, same direction of danger, down. We see this echo subtly in the geological record. Layers of impact glass, iridium spikes, nanodiamonds, soot horizons. Not proof of lost civilizations, but proof that the sky has tried to erase the Earth many times. Mass extinctions don't politely stay in dinosaur time. They ripple through the whole history of life. You begin to wonder, if cosmic threats are regular, like seasons on a galactic scale, how many times have they intersected with beings capable of building, thinking, remembering? And then another pattern appears. Lower, closer, more familiar. We keep doing it to ourselves. Lemuria falls not just because the crust moves, but because people ignore the warnings. Atlantis collapses under a combination of rising seas and engineered hubris. The Antediluvian giants tear the world apart with weapons that should never have existed. The builders push the planet's magnetic field to the brink. Even in the most recent reset, before the Younger Dryas, human activity might not cause the comet, but it magnifies the vulnerability. Settlements placed in river deltas, crops that depend on stable seasons, populations that cluster along coasts, cosmic dice, human kindling. The pattern is simple and brutal. A natural crisis arrives and meets a civilization at its most proud, most expansive, least willing to slow down. The environment becomes unstable at exactly the moment societies are least able to adapt. The higher the tower, the more fragile the balance. You see it in flood myths, tower myths, stories of pride punished by sudden disaster. These stories could just be moral lessons, or they could be distorted memories of very real times when nature shook the table and our ancestors had stacked their lives too high. Underneath those disasters, another thread runs quietly, almost invisibly. Knowledge rises, then it drowns. Every one of the 6 civilizations carries some form of advanced understanding. The ethereal ones manipulate energy and matter in ways that look like magic. Lemurians map currents in stone and sea. Atlanteans master geomancy, astronomy, hydrology. The antediluvian giants wield technologies of war so fine-tuned they scar continents. The builders understand magnetism, resonance, perhaps even soft forms of field engineering. The pre-Younger Dryas world has precise star maps, complex agriculture, sophisticated stoneworking long before textbooks say such things should exist. And every time, the same thing happens. The knowledge does not vanish cleanly, it shatters. Fragments survive in the strangest places. A myth here, a symbol there, an out-of-place artifact that doesn't make sense for its age, a story about the old ones who knew more than we do, instructions passed down in rituals no one fully understands anymore. You can watch this process in real time with any catastrophe. Libraries burn, but a few books are rescued. Universities collapse, but one apprentice remembers a single technique. A complex machine breaks, but someone keeps one small component because it looks beautiful. Over centuries, the context decays. The function becomes legend. The legend becomes myth. The pattern suggests that we might not be inventing each new technology entirely from scratch. We might be rediscovering, reassembling scattered pieces of a puzzle that's been built and broken many times before. And this leads to one of the most haunting patterns of all, the survivor. Every culture has some version of the figure who sees the end coming, or is chosen to live through it. A man told to build a boat, a woman who hides in a mountain, a family guided underground, a group led to a land that the waters cannot reach. In Mesopotamia, it's Utnapishtim. In the Hebrew tradition, Noah. In India, Manu. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha. Among Native American, African, Pacific and Arctic cultures, there are dozens more. Sometimes the disaster is a flood, sometimes fire, sometimes ice, sometimes a dark sun or star that falls. The details shift, the archetype does not. A warning, a chosen survivor, instructions to carry something through the chaos. Seeds, animals, stories, tools, holy books, sacred numbers. And almost always, when the waters recede or the sky clears, the survivor is told to rebuild, to restore what was before, or to remember the ways of the elders. It's tempting to write this off as human psychology. Of course, societies imagine total destruction and one lucky family. It explains survival, gives meaning to chaos. But when the same basic narrative appears independently on different continents, among people who supposedly never met, you at least have to consider another possibility. That at some point, somewhere, small groups really did ride out global-scale disasters, then carried their memories into the new world like a candle carried through a storm. If that's true, then another pattern becomes visible. Not just survivors, but keepers, mystery schools, secret brotherhoods, priesthoods sworn to silence, orders that claim an unbroken chain of teaching from before the flood, from the first time, from the age when gods walked among men. In Egypt, tales of the followers of Horus and the hidden wisdom of Thoth. In Greece, the Eleusinian and Orphic mysteries, promising revelations of cosmic cycles. In India, the notion of ancient rishis who heard primordial truths. Among the Maya, the keepers of the Khatan counts. In medieval Europe and the Islamic world, alchemists obsessed with recovering a lost prima materia and a primordial science. Maybe some of this is theatre, authority dressed up in myth, but the structure is suggestive. Restricted knowledge, initiations, layers of meaning hidden inside symbols, timelines measured not in years but in world ages. It feels like the social technology you would invent if you believed deeply that another reset was inevitable, and that only tightly guarded knowledge had any chance of surviving it. Underneath all of this runs the oldest pattern of civilization itself: rise, peak, corruption, fall. At first, each civilization is lean, adaptive, close to the land. The ethereal ones cooperate with cosmic forces. Lemurians build in harmony with tides and tectonics. Early Atlanteans harness water without trying to own the whole ocean. The builders study fields and stones patiently. Pre-Younger Dryas cultures read the sky with humility. Then population grows, systems thicken, hierarchies harden, elites form, energy use spikes, control replaces cooperation, weapons become more tempting. Short-term gain starts to outweigh long-term balance. Corruption here doesn't just mean evil, it means misalignment. Structures that once served life begin to serve themselves. When crisis finally arrives, a flare from the sun, a shifting pole, a comet, a sudden meltwater pulse, the system is no longer flexible enough to bend, so it breaks. We see this cycle replayed on smaller scales in empires we can actually study. Sumer, Egypt, Rome, the Maya, Angkor. Rapid expansion, golden age, complexity, overreach, strain, collapse. Maybe we're just projecting that pattern backwards onto imaginary civilizations. Or maybe the pattern is real because the constraints are real. Limited resources, finite attention, fragile ecologies. The last question, then, is whether all these alignments are coincidence or signal. Skeptics point out correctly that humans are pattern-seeking animals. We stitch meaning into noise. We love cycles because they make chaos feel manageable. It's entirely possible that flood myths, cosmic fears, and tales of fallen golden ages are just the way a clever primate copes with a dangerous planet. But it's also possible that the planet really is that dangerous, that the cosmos really does send periodic tests in the form of impacts and radiation and orbital quirks, that complex societies really do tend to overreach in similar ways, and that when you mix repeating natural hazards with repeating social mistakes, you naturally get repeating stories. From that perspective, the patterns aren't prophecy, they're memory. Dim, distorted, symbolic memory. But memory all the same. 6 cycles behind us, if the legends are even half true. 6 times of learning and forgetting, building and breaking, knowing and losing. We stand at the far end of that chain, convinced we're unique, that our science and technology set us apart forever. But in the quiet moments, when you zoom out far enough, another possibility emerges. Maybe we are not an exception. Maybe we are just the latest turn of a very old wheel. If all of this is true, if we really might be the 7th in a long line of civilizations, then some trace of the others should still be here. Not obvious ruins standing in plain view, not skyscrapers half buried in the sand. Time, erosion, plate tectonics and ice would have erased almost everything. Almost. What would actually survive hundreds of thousands of years? Not paper, not wood, not most metals. What would remain are hints, fragments, anomalies that don't quite fit. The archaeological record is full of them. Little puzzles that researchers file away, note, debate, and then quietly move past because they don't fit the main story. But if you look closely, if you read the footnotes instead of the headlines, a strange pattern starts to appear. Some of the most provocative clues are what researchers call out-of-place artifacts, OOP arts, objects that seem too advanced, too precise, or just too early for the layers of Earth they were found in. Take the so-called ancient batteries of Mesopotamia, clay jars, copper cylinders, iron rods. When first examined, most archaeologists saw them as simple storage vessels or ritual objects. But when modern experimenters reconstructed them with vinegar or grape juice inside, they produced a detectable electrical current. Not a lot. Enough to sting, enough to plate a metal surface with a thin sheen. Were they really batteries? Or are we forcing a modern interpretation onto something we don't fully understand? The truth is, we don't know. There are no instruction manuals, no diagrams showing lines of jars linked together lighting up temples, but the design is strangely functional, too functional to ignore. Then there are precision tools and cuts in stone that raise uncomfortable questions. Drill holes in granite that spiral in ways suggesting high rotational speed. Saw marks that are straight, smooth, and uniform, as if made by rigid metal blades under consistent pressure. In some sites, stone blocks fit so tightly together that a razor blade can't slide between them. The surface is polished, the edges sharp and consistent across hundreds of tons of material. Mainstream archaeology usually explains these with persistence and ingenuity. Sand, water, harder stones used as abrasives, wooden drills with sand-charged tips, and in many cases that explanation is perfectly adequate. Human patience applied over decades can do extraordinary things, but then you run into anomalies. A bored hole with a spiral groove spacing that implies each rotation removed more material than soft copper tools, and sand should reasonably manage. A symmetry in hard stone statues that suggests templates and gauges, or even some kind of mechanical assistance. Not lasers, not science fiction, just technologies a bit more refined than we officially credit to those times. Individually, each artifact can be argued away, reinterpreted, classified as misdated, misdescribed, or misunderstood. But collectively they create a faint outline of a story we don't quite have the courage to tell. The same pattern appears when we look up at impossible architecture. Consider the giant stone blocks of certain megalithic sites. Some weigh dozens, even hundreds of tons. They were quarried miles away, somehow shaped to exacting standards and transported across rugged terrain. We have theories, rollers, ramps, sleds on wet clay, and many of those methods have been demonstrated on a small scale, but scale matters. When you try to apply those techniques to the heaviest blocks, when you factor in the manpower, the food, the rope, the coordination, the logistics become staggering. Not impossible, but right on the edge of what a pre-industrial society could manage. Now layer in something else. Alignments. Many ancient structures are positioned with astonishing precision to cardinal directions, solstices, equinoxes, and specific stars. Large stone complexes encoding not just orientation, but cycles of precession, eclipses, and planetary movements. Over and over across different cultures we see architecture that's not just functional or ceremonial, but mathematical, astronomical, as if each structure was a storage device, not just for bodies, but for knowledge. Again, none of this proves an earlier global civilization, but it does whisper that somebody, at some time, had a level of organized understanding that keeps surprising us. We see another set of whispers in ancient maps. There are old charts that appear to show coastlines with eerie accuracy long before official exploration reached those regions. Some early modern maps seem to outline the shape of South America's east coast too well for a world supposedly still guessing. Other fragments appear to hint at land masses in polar regions, with contours that, some argue, resemble the underlying rock now hidden beneath ice. Skeptics point out that cartographers were skilled at extrapolation, that coastlines can be approximated from partial data, and that's true. Map-making combines art and math, and a lot of informed guesswork, but then you notice details. River mouths in roughly correct positions, mountain chains indicated where they actually exist, proportions that are surprisingly close. It's as if the mapmakers weren't starting from scratch, but copying, combining and updating older sources. And those older sources, we don't have them, they're gone. We just see faint echoes in the margins of later works, like ghosts in the parchment. Not all evidence is carved in stone or inked on vellum. Some of the most persistent clues live in voices, in stories passed down through people whose ancestors never wrote books, but who remembered. Indigenous traditions around the world contain accounts of floods, fires from the sky, rising seas, sinking lands and star beings, entire continents swallowed, suns that went dark, moons that fell. Conventional scholarship often interprets these as symbolic, psychological, or purely mythic. Allegories for seasonal changes, wars, or social transitions. But oral traditions can be astonishingly durable. Studies of some Pacific Islander communities suggest navigational knowledge preserved accurately through chants for hundreds of years. Australian Aboriginal songlines may encode landscape features that go back tens of thousands of years, describing coastlines before the sea rose after the last glacial maximum. If a comet struck, if an ocean surged inland, if an island chain slowly drowned over generations, how would you preserve that? You'd tell the story to your children. You'd wrap warnings in myth, attach them to gods, songs, ceremonies. Generation after generation would recite them, not necessarily knowing they were also reciting a geological memory. Now imagine we are the 7th civilization. How many of our own stories might be like that? Echoes of older worlds, translated and retranslated so many times that the original referent is almost invisible. Some researchers claim there is more concrete evidence. They speak of sites uncovered and then reburied, artifacts catalogued and locked away because they don't match the expected timeline. Bones with unusual proportions, tools found in strata far older than the human presence we currently accept. Reports of drilled teeth, metal spheres, machined objects in coal seams. Many of these claims crumble under scrutiny. Misidentifications, exaggerations, sometimes outright hoaxes. But not all of them are so easily dismissed. Occasionally a discovery surfaces, gets a brief burst of attention, then quietly disappears into academic argument, seldom mentioned to the public again. It's not that there is a vast coordinated conspiracy to hide the truth. Real life is usually messier and more mundane. Research funding depends on fitting into existing frameworks. Careers are built on defending or slightly modifying dominant models, not detonating them. Strange finds are often inconvenient. They demand time, resources, and the emotional energy to rethink what you thought you knew. So anomalies tend to get parked on the margins, labelled as unresolved, and left to gather dust. This doesn't mean that every fringe theory is right, or that any specific claim about lost civilizations is true. But it does suggest that our picture of the past is incomplete, biased toward what's easiest to see and simplest to explain. Think of our historical knowledge as a tiny island of light in an enormous ocean of darkness. We study what's illuminated and write textbooks about the visible shoreline, but the ocean is still there, all around us, deep and largely unexplored. The bottleneck that almost erased us left genetic scars we can still read. If there were earlier rises and falls, earlier experiments in intelligence and complexity, their traces would be far fainter. A worn tool in the wrong layer, a myth about a world that drowned, an impossible stone cut that hints at missing techniques. Mainstream history may not be wrong so much as incomplete. A first draft written from the fragments we've found so far, but drafts can be revised, new pages can be added, entire chapters can emerge when a single piece of evidence suddenly makes sense of 100 little anomalies. If we really are the 7th civilization, then we're walking over the graves and foundations of the first 6 every day, mostly without knowing it. The clues are there, in artifacts that don't fit, in architecture that defies expectation, in maps that remember more than they should, in stories that refuse to die. Whether those clues point to forgotten global cultures or just to pockets of brilliance that flared and faded, they remind us of something humbling. We do not yet know our own past, not fully, and if we don't know where we've truly come from, then we also don't fully understand where we are in the cycle, or what might be coming next. We are the 7th, at least that's what the pattern suggests. 6 rises, 6 collapses. 6 times the planet shook itself like a dog coming out of deep water, and whatever glittering culture covered its skin was flung off, shattered, buried. And now, us. So where do we fit in this cycle? If you zoom out far enough, our civilization is unbelievably young. Anatomically, modern humans have been around for roughly 300,000 years. Behaviorally modern humans, capable of art, complex tools and symbolic thought, for at least 50,000. Yet the thing we usually mean when we say civilization, cities, writing, money, states, organized religions, that appears almost out of nowhere about 6,000 years ago. For hundreds of thousands of years, no cities, no palaces, no great temples carved from stone. Then, suddenly, in a geological blink, you get Sumer in Mesopotamia. You get the Nile kingdoms in Egypt. You get the Indus Valley, with its gridded streets and drainage systems. Shortly after, you get Shang China, the Olmec in Mesoamerica, mysterious megaliths rising in Europe and Asia and the Pacific. It's like someone flipped a switch. From a deep time perspective, our entire written history, every king list, every holy book, every empire, fits into a tiny sliver at the end of a very long night. If Earth's history since the bottleneck were a 24-hour day, agriculture shows up in the last few minutes before midnight. The first city lights turn on in the final seconds. We're living in those seconds. But what if they're not the first lights that ever shone? Because here's the strange thing. Civilization doesn't just appear. It stacks. It builds on knowledge. To get a city, you need agriculture, irrigation, social organization, mathematics, trade networks, religious systems that can bind large groups of strangers together. You need metallurgy, astronomy, navigation. You need stories powerful enough to make people cooperate on projects they will never see completed. And in our case, a lot of that seems to appear fully formed, like it's being remembered instead of invented. Take Sumer. The earliest cuneiform tablets we've found aren't simple doodles. They're already keeping track of grain rations, labour, taxes. That implies there was a whole pre-writing phase of administration we barely glimpse. Egyptian hieroglyphs arrive already complex. The myths, the gods, the cosmic structures they describe feel old the moment they hit the page, as if they were already ancient when someone finally carved them into stone. It's as though our seventh civilization woke up with fragments of older dreams still clinging to it. You see it in the myths of golden ages before the current world. In India, the Yugas, vast cycles of rise and decline. In Greece, the ages of man, gold, silver, bronze, heroic, iron. In Mesoamerica, the 5 suns, successive worlds created and destroyed. Again and again, cultures on opposite sides of the planet insist this is not the first time. You see it in architecture. Megalithic alignments that track solstices and equinoxes with eerie precision long before formal science appears. Temples and pyramids that encode star positions, precession cycles, lunar months. Structures built by people who supposedly had just recently discovered farming. Why does the second you get stone, you get astronomy? Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe it's just the predictable way human curiosity unfolds once you have food security. Or maybe, buried under our myths and rituals and symbols, are faint instructions from the civilizations that came before us. Not literal blueprints, more like resonance patterns, intuitions. A sense that this is how you build a world. Because someone did, long ago. Modern religions and philosophies might be part of that inheritance. Strip away the surface differences and many of them sound as if they're responding to the same deep memory. Flood stories that show up in Mesopotamia, in the Bible, in India, in Mesoamerica, in Aboriginal Australia. Tales of towers reaching the heavens and being destroyed. Serpents and dragons associated with knowledge and catastrophe. Fires from the sky. Days when the sun stood still. Oceans that boiled. Mountains that walked. To a modern listener, these are myths. To someone who survived a reset, they would be history, retold 1,000 times until the details blurred and only symbols remained. Even the ethical cores of major traditions hint at knowledge born from repeated collapse, Don't build on sand. Don't worship wealth. Don't assume the current order is permanent. Treat others as yourself because in a small, fragile world, cruelty rebounds. Pride comes before a fall. Empires rise and fall like waves. These aren't just moral slogans. They sound like advice from people who watched entire ages vanish. Our seventh civilization, the one we're living in right now, sits on a mountain of such warnings, and yet behaves as if we're exempt from the pattern, as if resets are things that happened back then to people who were less clever, less advanced, less us. But look at the triggers that the earlier cycles in your story faced. Great subsidence of land, sudden sea level rise, planetary scale wars, magnetic disturbances, comet impacts, rapid climate swings that turned fertile plains into deserts in a human lifetime. Now hold those in your mind and compare them to what's happening around you. We have built our global system on coastal megacities and finely tuned climate zones, while the ice caps melt and sea levels creep higher each year. We've wrapped the planet in a fragile web of technology, satellites, cables, power grids, while our star occasionally throws tantrums of plasma that can fry electronics on a continental scale. We detonate weapons whose smallest versions could erase entire ancient kingdoms in an instant, while still struggling with conflicts over land, belief and identity. Our atmosphere and oceans are absorbing the waste heat and chemicals of our success, shifting currents and weather patterns in ways we barely understand. We are, for the first time, a single, interconnected meta-population. The whack-a-mole safety of the bottleneck era, small groups separated by distance, has been replaced by a global monoculture of supply chains and just-in-time systems. In earlier ages, a disaster could take out a region and leave the rest of the world's humans untouched. Now, a sufficiently large shock, natural or self-inflicted, could cascade through the entire network. We like to imagine resets as sudden, cinematic events. One day everything's fine, the next day the sky falls. But many of the real triggers seem to be slow accumulations of stress, quietly building until a threshold is crossed. Ice sheets thinning year by year until they suddenly carve. Tensions escalating war by war until one miscalculation lights the fuse. Fields farmed year after year until the soil is dust, and one bad drought breaks a civilization's back. The unsettling part is not that our situation is unique, it's how familiar it looks in hindsight. A species that mastered fire, then metal, then energy. A culture that expanded rapidly, covering continents, monumental building projects, faith in its own permanence, blindness to long-term consequences, signals in the environment turning from whispers to warnings, while daily life goes on as if nothing truly fundamental could change. We are extraordinary. The seventh civilization has done things none of the others, as far as we know, ever achieved. We've seen our planet from orbit. We've read its ancient climate in ice and stone. We've mapped the scars of old impacts and measured the flip-flopping of its magnetic field. We are uniquely aware that resets happen, and yet awareness is not immunity. Our place in the cycle might be this: the first civilization to stand at the edge of another potential reset while holding, in its hands, both the tools to trigger it and the knowledge that it could happen. Whether that knowledge is enough to change the pattern, that's the question that hangs over every quiet night, every city light shining against the dark, every story we tell about worlds that ended and worlds that began again. We are the seventh. The cycle brought us here. What we do next decides whether there will be an eighth. By now you've seen the pattern. Civilizations rise, flourish, push against the limits of their world, and then something happens. Sometimes it's ice, sometimes it's fire, sometimes it's water or stone falling from the sky. Each reset looks different on the surface, but under all of them there's the same quiet question. What ends the story? If we really are the seventh civilization in a long, half-remembered line, then we have to ask something uncomfortable. Not just what ended them, what could end us? Start far above your head, out beyond the soft blue of the sky, beyond the gentle circle of the moon. The cosmos is not peaceful. It only looks that way from the ground. Space is full of debris left over from the birth of the solar system. Asteroids, comets, icy bodies drifting in slow, patient orbits. Most will never come near us. They've travelled the same paths for billions of years without incident. But every so often gravity reaches out a finger and nudges one. A tiny shift, a subtle pull from Jupiter, a faint resonance with Earth's orbit, and suddenly that harmless rock becomes a future crater. We know this has happened before. The dinosaurs didn't vanish because they were weak or stupid. They vanished because 10 kilometers of rock travelling faster than a bullet hit the Yucatan and turned their world into a furnace. The scars are still there. Shocked quartz, a buried crater, a thin layer of global ash. Humanity has seen smaller versions. Tunguska in 1908, an explosion over Siberia that flattened forests for miles with no warning at all. Chelyabinsk in 2013, a city blasted by a meteor that no one saw coming until it was already burning through the atmosphere. These were hints, gentle taps on the shoulder compared to what could happen. We map near-Earth objects now. We track orbits, calculate probabilities, run simulations. But our survey is incomplete. There are still dark, uncharted bodies out there, coming from directions we can't easily watch. It doesn't take intent. It doesn't take malice. Just timing. Just geometry. And rocks aren't the only gift the sun can send. Our star is not a calm, golden disk. It's a boiling sphere of plasma, laced with magnetic storms. Every 11 years or so, its magnetic field flips, and in the process, it lashes out. Solar flares, coronal mass ejections, waves of charged particles that race outward at millions of kilometers per hour. Most days, Earth's magnetic field shrugs and deflects them. We get auroras, pretty curtains of light at the poles, but every once in a great while the sun throws something stronger. In 1859, the Carrington event lit up the skies as far south as the Caribbean, set telegraph lines on fire and shocked operators through metal keys. And that was in a world lit by gas lamps and powered by steam. Imagine a Carrington-level storm now. Or worse, one of the super flares we've seen on stars like our sun. Satellites fried, power grids melted, communications down for months or years. No guiding lights in the sky at night but the stars themselves. No global internet, no instant trades, no real-time weather forecasts. Our civilization doesn't end in a single flash. It frays, it unravels. Some researchers whisper about larger cycles. As the solar system orbits the galaxy, it passes through different regions of interstellar space. Denser clouds, cosmic ray-rich zones, galactic arms full of star-forming chaos. Could these grand, slow circuits alter our climate, tweak our magnetic field, increase the frequency of impacts or flares? The data is thin, the model's uncertain, but the idea lingers. Maybe the cosmos itself has seasons. We just haven't lived long enough to recognize them clearly. Come back down to Earth. The dangers here are slower, deeper, hidden under your feet. Beneath the crust, the mantle shifts and flows. Heat rises from the core, carrying ancient radioactivity and leftover energy from the planet's birth. Most of the time it escapes quietly along mid-ocean ridges and scattered volcanoes, but sometimes it accumulates in vast sleeping chambers of magma. Supervolcanoes, Yellowstone in North America, Toba in Indonesia, Campi Flegrei near Naples. Most days they're tourist attractions or background scenery, but their past eruptions have dusted continents with ash, dimmed the sun, and possibly pushed earlier humans close to the edge. A true super eruption wouldn't just devastate one country. It would load the stratosphere with aerosols, cool the planet, shorten growing seasons for years. Crops would fail in places that never see a single falling ash flake. Then there's Earth's magnetic field, our invisible shield. It has flipped many times in the past. North becomes south, south becomes north. These reversals aren't instant. They smear over thousands of years, a slow dance of weakening, wandering poles and temporary multipoles. Some geologists think reversals might be linked to climate swings or increased radiation at the surface. Not civilization ending on their own, perhaps. But in a world already stretched thin, even a modest increase in ultraviolet, a bit more stress on the ozone layer could amplify other problems. Tectonic plates keep moving too. The same forces that raised the Himalayas and ripped apart Pangaea haven't stopped. Most years we experience their power as earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic arcs. But over tens of millions of years, entire continents shift, ocean currents redirect, and global climate reorganizes. Our sixth civilization may have watched ice sheets crumble and sea levels surge as their own tectonic backdrop shifted ever so slightly. For us, the timescales feel longer than our attention span, but for a species that dreams of being permanent, they matter. And then there's the most volatile force on the planet, us. Unlike asteroids or magma, we're not bound to slow cycles or blind orbits. We can compress catastrophe into an afternoon. Nuclear weapons turned human anger into a planetary scale hazard. For the first time in Earth's history, a single species could, in theory, darken its own skies with soot, punch holes in its own ozone layer, and poison its own biosphere in a matter of hours. Even a limited exchange between regional powers could loft enough smoke into the stratosphere to chill global temperatures and disrupt agriculture. Not an extinction, maybe, but a reset. A brutal pruning back to something smaller, more fragile, more local. Environmental collapse is slower, but no less dangerous. We're re-engineering the atmosphere and the oceans in real time. Greenhouse gases accumulating faster than at almost any point in the geological record. Forests shrinking, topsoil thinning, species vanishing, coral reefs bleaching, ice sheets oozing toward the sea. Our sixth civilization might have faced something like this at the end of the last ice age, but they didn't have 8 billion mouths and global supply chains depending on stable weather. There's a line between adaptation and overload. Ecosystems can bend astonishingly far, but if you heat them too quickly, acidify them too rapidly, strip them too thoroughly, they don't just bend. They snap into new, unfamiliar states, less productive, less predictable, less kind. And then there's the newest player on the stage, artificial intelligence. We created tools. Tools created machines. Machines created networks. Networks are now growing minds made of silicon and code. They don't think like we do. They don't need what we need. In the best stories, they help us solve problems we could never crack alone. In the worst, they amplify every human flaw, greed, fear, tribalism, to planetary scale. An AI doesn't have to wake up and wage war on humanity to be dangerous. It only has to optimize the wrong thing. Profit without restraint, efficiency without resilience, control without wisdom. A system like that could steer resource use, politics, even warfare into narrow corridors that leave us no room to correct course until it's too late. When you line all these threats up, cosmic, geological, self-inflicted, it's tempting to look for a pattern. Some people insist there is one. Ancient calendars and prophetic texts hint at cosmic cycles and predetermined ages. The Mayan long count calendar, misunderstood and sensationalized, was said to end in 2012. In reality, it simply rolled over like an odometer into a new Baktun. But the idea stuck. that time itself comes in great repeating blocks, each with its own character, its own birth and death. In India, the Hindu Yugas describe 4 vast ages, from a golden era of virtue to a dark age of conflict and ignorance. Depending on who you ask, we are deep into the Kali Yuga, the final, most chaotic phase. Some interpretations stretch these cycles over millions of years. Others compress them into more manageable spans. Either way, the story is the same. Rise, decline, reset, repeat. In the 20th century, Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, spoke of Atlantis, pole shifts, and earth changes. He placed cataclysmic events around the late 20th and early 21st centuries, hinting that land would rise and sink, that Earth's orientation could shift suddenly, that coastlines would be redrawn. Scientists point out that true crustal pole shifts are not like flipping a toy globe. They are slow, complex, and constrained by physics. But Cayce's visions echo older myths: worlds overturned, seas invading land, mountains crumbling. Are these precise predictions? Or are they metaphors, mythic ways of talking about something we've always sensed? That history doesn't flow in a straight line, but in pulses, surges, and crashes. Even the more sober minds among us sometimes ask whether there's a schedule. Do mass extinctions cluster roughly every 26 or 30 million years, as some early studies claimed? Do orbital cycles like Milankovitch rhythms, changes in Earth's tilt and orbit, set the timing for ice ages, sea level rises, and perhaps even cultural collapses? The evidence is messy. Some patterns seem real, others vanish when new data is added. It's as if we're trying to read a cosmic calendar with half the pages torn out. That brings us to the last quiet question. If there is a cycle, is it destiny or just probability? Our ancestors in earlier civilizations might have looked up at the sky, watched the weather turn, felt the ground tremble, and believed that the gods had decided, that the age of their people was over, that nothing they did could matter. We know more now. We can track asteroids, monitor the sun, map magma chambers, measure atmospheric chemistry in parts per million. We can model futures on supercomputers. We can see the possible hammers coming down in a way no earlier civilization could. But knowledge is not the same as control. We may not be able to stop a supervolcano or a wandering star. We may never fully tame the chaos of tectonics or the whims of the sun. Some resets might be baked into the structure of this planet, this solar system, this galaxy, rare but inevitable over long enough stretches of time. Yet not all catastrophes are beyond us. We can deflect small asteroids. We can harden our grids against solar storms. We can choose not to unleash nuclear winter. We can slow the damage to oceans and forests. We can design technologies, including AI, that serve resilience instead of only speed and growth. Maybe that is the real difference between us and the civilizations that came before. Not that we're smarter or more moral, but that we finally stand at a point where understanding meets responsibility, where the cycle is no longer just something that happens to us, but something we can lean against, even if only slightly. Maybe the universe will always have its tempests, its impacts, its long, dark winters. Maybe resets can never be completely avoided, but their timing, their severity, the number of survivors huddled around the next fire, those might not be entirely out of our hands. And if every past reset has forged a new kind of human, more adaptable, more complex, more aware, then perhaps the choice before us now is simple and impossibly hard. Will we wait for the next hammer to fall, or will we use the brief, fragile calm between catastrophes to learn how not just to endure the cycle, but to bend it? Imagine the clock jumping forward 12,000 years. Not 100, not 1,000, 12 millennia. Longer than the distance from the pyramids to today. Longer than the gap between the last Ice Age hunters and your phone lighting up on the nightstand. What does the world look like, and what's left of you? Start small. Picture your room, the bed, the shelves, the glowing rectangles that run your life. Give it a few decades without maintenance. The roof leaks, mold creeps, metal rusts, plastics crack and crumble under sunlight. Within a couple of centuries the building collapses, the glass shatters, the circuit boards corrode into green dust. In 1,000 years a forest or a desert or an ocean has quietly claimed the space where you're lying right now. 12,000 years from now, your city is gone. Not damaged, not abandoned. Gone in any sense a casual passerby would recognize. Asphalt buckles and turns back into gravel. Steel beams oxidize into reddish streaks in the soil. Skyscrapers, highways, cars, all the proud symbols of your era are reduced to confused layers in the rock record. A thin line of strange chemistry sandwiched between older, quieter sediments. Digital information does even worse. All the knowledge you've poured into the cloud, all the libraries compressed onto servers and drives and magnetic tape, every message, photograph, film, everything that convinced you this age was immortal, depends on stable power, controlled temperature, careful maintenance. Hard drives seize up in years, not centuries. Flash storage slowly loses its charge. Even archival media decays. Left alone, your global data stream dies faster than parchment, faster than ink on stone. The internet is an empire of ghosts that cannot exist without air conditioning and replacement parts. Stone, meanwhile, just keeps doing what stone does. Look at Göbekli Tepe, 12,000 years old and still recognizable as deliberate architecture. Look at megaliths that survived glacial melt, storms, earthquakes, human wars. Crude stone tools survive 1,000,000 years in some cases. Carved rocks and etched ceramics laugh at the timescales that obliterate your most advanced storage devices. If a future civilization goes looking for us, that's what they're most likely to find. Not your passwords, not your streaming accounts, not your social media archives, but the blunt, heavy things we built to resist gravity and time, carved stone, reinforced concrete, deep-buried structures, tunnels cut into bedrock, maybe the skeletons of our bridges and dams. To them, we might look like a people obsessed with moving rock and water, but even those solid monuments aren't guaranteed. Glaciers grind mountains into flour. Tectonic plates subduct entire continents back into the mantle. Forests pull down cities, roots prying apart foundations one patient season at a time. Sea level rise drowns coastal megacities in silt. Volcanoes erase landscapes overnight and then, over thousands of years, quietly biodegrade the evidence under layers of ash and lava. 12,000 years is long enough for coastlines to redraw, for deserts to migrate, for entire river systems to shift. It's long enough for another ice age to advance and retreat. Long enough for your most familiar geography to become an archaeologist puzzle, a half-remembered map with missing corners. So the question becomes uncomfortable. If that's what time can do to us, what did it already do to whoever came before? We dig and we find anomalies, out-of-place artifacts, puzzling alignments, whispered legends of sunken lands and sky fires, and we argue about them. Are they evidence? Are they coincidence? Are they misinterpretations layered on top of misinterpretations? We don't know. Maybe we can't know. But we do know this. Your own civilization right now is fragile in ways that feel almost comical once you zoom out. You think of yourself as high-tech, but your memories live on fragile magnetic grains. Your history is written in a language future humans might not even be able to read. Your files depend on code formats that become obsolete in a decade, let alone an epoch. If a future archaeologist finds a data center deep under some ancient silt, they'll see racks of mysterious metal frames, thin plates, tangled cables. Without power and context, it's just junk. By contrast, a carved granite block with a simple pictograph on it may still speak clearly. A stone calendar aligned to solstices will still catch the light at dawn. A monolith pointed at a specific star will still hint, someone was watching the sky from here. So what will they actually see? They'll see a sudden, sharp spike of odd chemistry in the geological record, traces of plastics embedded in sediments, unusual isotopes from nuclear reactions, a global layer of pollution that appears almost simultaneously on every continent. They might see mass extinctions clustered around our time, species disappearing from pollen records, from fossil layers, from ancient DNA found in the soil, coral reefs dying and leaving behind bleached, broken skeletons, forest compositions changing as climate zones lurch poleward. They might find large-scale quarries, scars in ancient bedrock where we ripped resources out of the ground at industrial scales. They might stumble on the rusted bones of oil rigs, the remains of open-pit mines, the subterranean teeth marks of subway systems that cut through old stone like burrowing metallic worms. Will they know we had satellites? Probably not, unless they're very lucky. Most of those will have burned up, fallen, or drifted out past any easy reach. Will they know we mapped our own DNA, walked on the moon, manipulated atoms one by one? Not unless some artifacts of those activities happen to end up in the small fraction of matter that gets preserved and then discovered. The odds are against specific details. What survives is pattern. A sudden technological flare, a strange chemical anomaly, a brief geological moment when a clever, tool-using primate rewired the planet and then, maybe, vanished, or maybe transformed into something else. And here's the twist. You're not just passively waiting to be forgotten. Right now, people are actively trying to send messages forward through deep time, to cheat oblivion. We carve warnings about nuclear waste into stone, in words we hope future languages can decode, in symbols we hope instinct can understand. This place is dangerous. Don't dig here. Stay away. We design time capsules, buried in vaults, filled with records of who we were, what we knew, what we valued. We upload cultural memory onto gold records and strap them to spacecraft, hoping that one day, someone, somewhere, will play them back. Projects like the Long Now Foundation dream of clocks that tick for 10,000 years, libraries preserved in microscopic etchings on metal, stories that can be handed across dozens of generations instead of just one or two. Scientists talk about digital dark ages and search for materials, sapphire glass, etched tungsten, DNA storage, that might keep our data readable far beyond the lifespan of any hard drive. It's touching, almost painfully human, this urge to be remembered, to tell our story to an audience that may never exist. But the humbling truth is that we might already be someone else's forgotten epilogue. If 6 civilizations rose and fell before us, if cycles of fire and water and ice kept wiping the slate and writing new names on it, then we are, at best, one paragraph in a book far thicker than we realized. The ruins we cherish might be footnotes of an earlier age, themselves standing on the rubble of another, and another before that. And just as we squint at ancient stones and wonder what was meant, someday others might stand over the weathered foundations of our cities and do the same. They might tell stories about a vanished people who tamed lightning, who made the night glow, who spoke to metal and summoned images from nowhere. Maybe they'll be right in spirit and wrong in detail. Maybe they'll turn us into myth. There's a strange comfort in that. Because if the pattern is real, if civilizations rise and fall, if worlds reset again and again, then nothing is truly alone in time. Each age inherits echoes, leaves whispers, passes on a few stubborn fragments that refuse to die. Not intact libraries, not complete blueprints, but hints, seeds, suggestions. You are part of that chain. Your world may not last forever. Your data certainly won't. But some trace of what you're doing tonight, some chemical, some structure, some shifted pattern in the biosphere, will ripple forward into futures you will never see. Just as unknown hands, tens of thousands of years ago, shifted stones and lit fires that eventually led to you. Somewhere between being perfectly remembered and perfectly erased lies the reality. We survive as influences, not as full recordings, as tendencies and possibilities, not as detailed files. And maybe that's enough. If we are the seventh civilization, we're also a bridge. We carry the faint shadows of what came before, and we quietly prepare the ground for whatever or whoever comes after. We don't have to solve the mystery of the entire cycle to find peace in it. We only have to recognize that we're part of something larger than our brief moment of light. And in that realization, as the world outside goes quiet and your thoughts drift between past and future, it becomes easier to rest. The stones will remember what they can. The oceans will keep their secrets. The sky will witness the next beginning. You can close your eyes. Tonight you've drifted through a gallery of ghosts. You walked with the ethereal ones, that almost unimaginable first civilization, watching them reach toward the stars until the cosmos itself pushed back. You sank with Lemuria as continents softened and slipped away beneath rising seas. You heard the last echoes of Atlantis as water, weightless and patient, turned towers into reefs. You stood in the shadow of antediluvian giants, felt the ground tremble beneath the war that, if it happened, might have cracked the planet's memory in two. You traced the quiet genius of the builders, those careful hands that worked stone and sky while the magnetic field above them flickered and twisted. Then you wandered the green world before the Younger Dryas, that brief, almost gentle moment, ending in a sudden blaze of ice and fire from the sky. 6 civilizations, 6 endings, 6 questions that refuse to sit still. Maybe some of them never existed. Maybe all of them did, in ways we haven't yet learned to measure. The truth might be scattered in fragments under the ocean, buried beneath ice, locked inside myths that have been told and retold until fact and story are the same thing. We may never know exactly where the line runs between history and legend, between the stones we can touch and the memories we only feel. And that's okay. Not every mystery exists to be solved. Some are there to remind us that we're small, that our knowledge has edges, that beyond those edges there is room for wonder. The gaps in our understanding are not failures, they're invitations. Because there is a strange comfort in cycles. Every ending you heard about tonight, real or imagined, was also a beginning from another point of view. When the ethereal ones vanished, something simpler and tougher may have taken root in the ruins. When Lemuria slipped beneath the waves, shorelines shifted, and other coasts became possible homes. When comets fell, when poles wandered, when wars burned, life bent, but did not completely break. It changed shape. It tried again. If we are the 7th civilization, we are not standing outside this pattern. We are inside it right now. Our cities, our satellites, our maps of everything we think we understand. They are all just one more layer in Earth's long layered story. One day they will be dust or silt or the faintest outline on some future explorer's ground scan. But tonight, they're here, and so are you. As you lie there, letting your eyes grow heavy, you are part of an unbroken chain that reaches back through every bottleneck, every storm, every forgotten age. You carry atoms forged in ancient stars, water that has cycled through countless lungs, and maybe, just maybe, whispers from worlds that rose and fell before recorded time. Let those possibilities soften the edges of your thoughts. You don't have to decide what was real and what was myth. You can just drift between them, the way waves drift between deep ocean trenches and quiet shores. If questions appear, you don't need to chase them. Let them pass like clouds across an old patient sky. If you enjoyed wandering through these shadows of history, gently tap like and subscribe so you can find your way back here the next time you want to fall asleep with ancient worlds on your mind. When you're ready, leave a comment and tell us where you're listening from. A city, a small town, a ship at sea, somewhere out under the stars. Together, those little points of light in the comments become their own kind of constellation. There are more corners of the past to explore, more forgotten coastlines, more buried structures, more stories that might be memories wearing the mask of myth. Next time, we'll follow the trail a little farther, into other shadows, other questions that hum quietly beneath accepted history. For now, let the cycle turn without you needing to hold it. Let the rise and fall of lost civilizations become a slow, steady tide at the back of your mind. You have done enough for today. The world and all its mysteries will still be here in the morning. Just breathe and drift.